Throughout the Northwest Europe campaign, from June 1944 to May 1945, American intelligence officers conducted thousands of prisoner-of-war interrogations. Today, those reports, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, reveal a striking and consistent pattern. When German soldiers were asked which American weapon they feared most, the answer was overwhelming and unexpected. Not tanks, not aircraft, American artillery. This fear was not just verbal, it shaped German battlefield behavior. German units developed elaborate procedures to avoid American artillery observation. They moved primarily at night, when spotting aircraft could not see them. They dispersed formations to avoid presenting concentrated targets. Artillery batteries fired only brief missions, then displaced immediately to avoid counterfire. German soldiers quickly learned to recognize the distinctive high-pitched engine of the American Piper L-4 Cub observation aircraft. When they heard it overhead, they took cover at once. They knew what was coming. And it came fast. American artillery was feared not because its guns were superior. They were not. German 105mm and 155mm artillery pieces were excellent, often comparable or even superior in range and destructive power. The difference was not hardware. The difference was the system. Interrogation reports from France dated June through August 1944 repeatedly describe artillery fire that arrived with no warning, no ranging shots, no adjustment fire, just sudden, precise impacts on German positions. Even when those positions were concealed, recently occupied, or far from obvious landmarks, American shells landed accurately and in force. One Wehrmacht soldier captured near Saint-Lô in July 1944 told interrogators that fighting American artillery felt like fighting an enemy who could see everything at once and strike everywhere at the same time. German officers noticed something else. The timing was predictable. Once an L-4 Cub appeared, artillery fire followed in roughly 3 minutes. German company commanders began carrying stopwatches. The average time between aircraft sighting and the first shell's landing was 3 minutes and 10 seconds. For German artillery officers, this speed was shocking. In the German system, a typical fire mission required 12 to 15 minutes just to compute firing data, longer under combat conditions. Elevation, deflection, propellant charge, barrel wear, wind, and weather all had to be calculated manually using range tables, protractors, and slide rules. Under stress or with disrupted communications, the process could take 20 minutes or more. The idea that American units could receive coordinates, compute firing data from multiple batteries, coordinate massed fire, and execute it in 3 minutes seemed impossible. Yet they were doing it consistently. The explanation lay in an innovation developed during the interwar years at the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was called the Fire Direction Center. After World War I, American artillery officers studied the conflict closely. They recognized that artillery had been the decisive weapon of the war, causing more casualties than any other arm, but they also saw massive inefficiency. Enormous quantities of ammunition produced limited results. The problem wasn't the guns, it was coordination. World War I artillery largely operated at the battery level. Each battery computed its own firing data, and massing fires required elaborate pre-planning. Targets of opportunity were rarely engaged effectively. Beginning in 1929, Major Carlos Brewer, director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill, introduced reforms. He developed standardized firing charts and improved survey procedures that allowed batteries to know their exact locations, eliminating a major source of error. But one problem remained. Firing data computation was still slow and mathematically complex. The breakthrough came under Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward. Between 1932 and 1934, Ward developed the concept of centralized fire direction at the battalion level. Instead of each battery calculating independently, a single fire direction center controlled all guns in the battalion. The center received fire missions from forward observers, computed firing data centrally, and transmitted gun settings to every battery simultaneously. For the first time, true massed fires could be delivered rapidly and shifted just as quickly. The system was publicly demonstrated in 1931 when multiple batteries fired simultaneously under centralized control. The success was undeniable. Over the next decade, the Fire Direction Center became standard doctrine across the U.S. Army field artillery. But calculations were still slow until November 1940. That month, Captain Abbott Harrington Burns, serving at Fort Sill, invented the graphical firing table. Working through the night, Burns created a transparent chart-based tool, essentially a specialized slide rule that eliminated complex calculations entirely. Fire direction personnel could overlay the graphical firing table on their firing chart, align gun and target positions, and read firing data instantly. Computation became more than 20 times faster. Tasks that once required trained officers and intricate mathematics could now be performed by enlisted soldiers with basic arithmetic skills. By 1942, every American artillery battalion entering combat was equipped with fire direction centers and graphical firing tables. And by 1944, German soldiers across Northwest Europe had learned exactly what that meant. The combination of centralized control and rapid computation produced the response time that so shocked German opponents. From the moment a forward observer identified a target, coordinates could be transmitted to the Fire Direction Center, firing data computed, and orders distributed to multiple batteries, often within 3 minutes. Guns across a wide frontage would open fire almost simultaneously. No other army in World War II could match that speed. This system enabled a uniquely American technique known as time-on-target, or TOT. In a time-on-target mission, artillery units spread across several kilometers fired at carefully calculated intervals so that all shells arrived over the target at nearly the same moment, typically within a 3-second window. Guns closer to the target fired later. Guns farther away fired earlier. The timing was precise and the mathematics unforgiving. The effect was devastating. Instead of shells arriving sequentially, giving soldiers time to dive for cover after the first explosions, every round impacted at once. The entire bombardment occurred in a single instant before anyone could react. This mattered because most artillery casualties occur in the first few seconds before troops can go prone or reach cover. Time on target compressed the entire fire mission into those critical seconds, maximizing shock and casualties. German artillery could not execute time-on-target missions against opportunity targets. Their decentralized battery-level fire control system simply could not coordinate the necessary calculations and timing on short notice. German units could achieve simultaneous fires only after days of preparation, carefully surveying positions and pre-computing data against fixed targets. They could not do it on 3 minutes' notice. British artillery was more sophisticated than the German system, supported by excellent training and equipment. British officers developed highly effective fire planning procedures and achieved impressive concentrations. By 1941, Brigadier Jack Parham demonstrated the ability to coordinate 144 guns in a divisional concentration delivered within 5 minutes of the fire call. British artillery employed standardized fire missions known as Mike, Uncle, Victor, and William targets, each designation representing a different scale of massed fire. But British doctrine differed subtly from the American approach. British concentrations emphasized rapid massing of fire, but did not insist on simultaneous impact. Shells were expected to arrive over a short period rather than within a strict 3-second window. The difference was small on paper, but significant in practice. American time-on-target missions produced a sharper shock effect and higher immediate casualties. Soviet artillery operated on an entirely different philosophy. The Red Army possessed enormous numbers of guns and used them in massive preparatory bombardments that lasted hours and consumed staggering quantities of ammunition. At Kursk in July 1943, Soviet artillery fired more than 1.6 million shells during the opening bombardment. The sheer volume of fire was devastating and played a crucial role in breaking German attacks. But Soviet fire control remained relatively crude throughout the war. Batteries typically fired at area targets or pre-plotted coordinates with limited adjustment. Precision was secondary to volume. Shells often landed scattered across wide areas, and incidents of friendly fire were not uncommon. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower through quantity rather than accuracy. This approach was effective in the vast battles of the Eastern Front, where targets were large and densely concentrated, but it lacked the flexibility and responsiveness of the American system. American artillery doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and adaptability, and this was made possible by an unmatched forward observer network. American doctrine placed trained artillery observers down to company level and below within infantry and armored units. They maintained direct radio contact with battalion fire direction centers and could call for fire on any target they identified. They were not passive spotters. Forward observers were trained artillery officers or non-commissioned officers who understood fire direction procedures and worked directly with fire direction centers to adjust fire for maximum effect. Each artillery battalion maintained a liaison section that provided observers to supported units. When supporting an infantry regiment, liaison officers were typically assigned to each infantry battalion, with additional observers operating at company level as needed. Observers carried powerful radios that ensured reliable communication even under combat conditions. By 1943, the SCR-610 radio had become standard. With a range of approximately 20 miles, it allowed observers to remain in contact even when supported units were isolated or surrounded. Observers were trained extensively in target location. Using maps, plotting boards, compasses, and binoculars, a skilled observer could estimate range to within 50 meters at distances up to 2,000 meters, more than sufficient for accurate fire direction. They were also trained in adjustment procedures, using the clock system to describe corrections relative to previous impacts. An observer might call target at 12 o'clock, 200 meters, allowing the fire direction center to walk rounds precisely onto the target. But the true revolution in observation came from the air. The L-4 Cub was a military adaptation of the civilian Piper J-3 Cub, small, slow, and remarkably effective. Modified with oversized tires for rough fields, transparent roof panels for upward visibility, and radios for artillery communication, the aircraft became one of the most important fire control tools of the war. Powered by a 65-horsepower engine, the L-4 had a maximum speed of about 108 miles per hour.
It could take off and land in less than 300 feet, allowing it to operate from crewed forward airstrips close to the front lines. The Army Air Forces initially opposed organic artillery aviation, arguing that all aircraft should remain under centralized air control. Artillery officers countered that effective fire control required observers who understood artillery procedures and worked directly with fire direction centers to adjust fire for maximum effect. After intense bureaucratic debate, the War Department approved organic field artillery aviation in 1942. Each artillery battalion received 2 L-4 aircraft, flown by trained artillery officers. From altitudes between 1,000 and 1,500 feet, aerial observers could see miles in every direction. Targets invisible to ground observers, units in defilade, artillery hidden in tree lines, supply convoys moving behind the front, were suddenly exposed. Aerial observers could identify targets, estimate coordinates using maps and terrain references, and call for fire directly to the Fire Direction Center. More than 5,400 L-4 aircraft were produced during the war, and over 2,700 served with field artillery units in Europe. Their presence became a signature of American artillery dominance. German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Cub's small engine. When they heard it overhead, they took cover immediately. German tactical manuals issued in late 1944 included specific instructions for dealing with L-4 aircraft: cease movement, disperse, and seek cover. The Germans understood that once the Cub spotted them, artillery fire would arrive within minutes.
The L-4 Cubs were agile enough that pilots could often see anti-aircraft fire rising toward them and take evasive action. German fighters could easily intercept the slow, lightly armed aircraft, but operating fighter patrols near the front was dangerous. American air superiority meant German fighters sent to hunt Cubs frequently found themselves engaged by American escorts. As a result, many L-4 pilots completed entire combat tours without being shot down, despite flying daily missions over enemy territory. Over time, aerial observers developed close working relationships with the fire direction centers they supported. A battalion aerial observer might fly repeated missions with the same fire direction officer, coordinating his fires. These teams developed highly efficient communication methods. Observers could describe targets in shorthand phrases that fire direction officers understood instantly. The speed and precision of this coordination was remarkable. Experienced observer teams could identify a target, call for fire, and have shells landing within 2 to 3 minutes. Adjustments followed rapidly, and direct hits were often achieved against small targets, individual vehicles, gun pits, or even single artillery pieces. The psychological impact of the L-4s on German forces cannot be overstated. Their constant presence meant German units could never feel safe, not even far behind the front lines. Supply convoys were forced to move only at night or risk destruction. Artillery batteries had to remain concealed during daylight hours. Reserve units could not assemble in obvious locations. The Cubs imposed a state of permanent daylight paralysis. The integration of aerial observation with the Fire Direction Center created a level of battlefield awareness unprecedented in warfare. Fire Direction Centers maintained detailed operational maps showing friendly positions, confirmed enemy locations, suspected targets, and designated no-fire zones. When an aerial observer reported a target, the Fire Direction Center could immediately determine whether the area was safe to engage, which batteries were in range, and what level of fire was appropriate. For urgent targets, the entire decision cycle,
from identification to rounds on target, could be completed in under 3 minutes. This flexibility was revolutionary. German artillery doctrine relied on rigid command relationships. An infantry battalion was typically supported by a designated artillery battery. If additional firepower was needed, requests had to pass through higher headquarters, a slow, cumbersome process. American observers could request fire from any battery in range. Fire direction centers could mass fires from multiple battalions or even entire corps artillery almost instantly. General Omar Bradley later wrote that the Fire Direction Center system enabled extraordinary concentrations of fire. During the Battle of the Bulge, artillery units on the northern shoulder of the German penetration coordinated 348 guns from different divisions and corps. Spread across dozens of kilometers, these guns were brought under unified fire control and massed on critical targets within minutes. The battlefield effects were devastating. Nowhere was this more evident during Operation Lüttich, the German counteroffensive at Mortain in early August 1944. The German plan aimed to cut through American lines and reach Avranches on the coast, severing Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army forces advancing into Brittany. The attack began before dawn on August 7th. German armor and infantry advanced rapidly under cover of darkness when American aircraft could not intervene. Initial progress was made against surprised American units. But daylight changed everything. As the sun rose, American artillery observers lifted off in L-4 Cubs and began directing fire onto German columns. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division, fired thousands of rounds throughout the day. Batteries fired so continuously that gun barrels overheated and had to cool. Ammunition stocks were depleted, and supply trucks ran non-stop between dumps and gun positions. German tank commanders reported that maneuver became impossible. Every attempt to advance or reposition brought immediate artillery fire. Within minutes, shells landed precisely on their locations. Combined with fighter-bomber attacks directed by aerial observers who could see the entire battlefield, American firepower halted the German offensive completely. By August 8th, the attack had failed. By August 10th, German forces were retreating, and what had been intended as a decisive counterstroke became a disaster, leading to the destruction of much of the German 7th Army. At Mortain, the trust American soldiers placed in their artillery reached its ultimate expression. On Hill 314, Lieutenant Ralph Curley, commanding E Company, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, faced repeated assaults by the German 17th Panzer Grenadier Division. On the evening of August 7th, with German troops attacking his perimeter, Curley called artillery fire directly onto his own position. 84 howitzers delivered a 5-minute barrage at danger-close range. American soldiers took cover as best they could, trusting the precision of their artillery. German attackers were shattered and forced to withdraw. Curley's decision illustrated both the desperation of the fighting and the extraordinary confidence American forces had in their artillery system. Similar dominance was displayed earlier at Hill 192 near Saint-Lô. Hill 192 dominated the approaches to the city and had been heavily fortified by German forces with trenches, bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire. Repeated American attacks in late June and early July 1944 had failed. The 2nd Infantry Division planned a deliberate assault supported by overwhelming artillery. Division artillery included 3 battalions of 105 mm howitzers and 1 battalion of 155 mm howitzers, 48 guns in total. Through the Fire Direction Center system, additional corps artillery was added, bringing available firepower to almost 100 guns. The attack began on July 11, 1944. During the night of July 10th to 11th, American artillery fired 20 time-on-target missions, each one delivering massed fire from dozens of guns onto German positions. The bombardments were spaced to prevent rest or reorganization. Every hour or two, another sudden storm of shells struck, keeping defenders under constant psychological and physical stress. When the main assault began on July 11th, artillery thundered continuously. The 2nd Infantry Division fired 20,000 rounds in a single day, an average of more than 800 rounds per gun. German defenses collapsed. Hill 192 fell, opening the road to Saint-Lô, and confirming once again that American artillery was not simply a weapon, but a system of warfare no enemy could match.
The bombardment was so intense that German survivors reported a complete breakdown of command and control. Telephone lines were cut by shellfire. Runners could not move between positions. Commanders lost contact with subordinate units and often had no idea where friendly forces were located. When American infantry finally advanced behind the artillery preparation, German resistance was fragmented and ineffective. Hill 192 was secured by early afternoon on July 11, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge, from December 1944 through January 1945, provided another dramatic demonstration of American artillery dominance. When German forces launched their surprise offensive on December 16th, they achieved tactical surprise and made significant initial gains. But American artillery recovered from the shock within hours and began delivering coordinated fire across the entire front. On the northern shoulder of the German penetration, near Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery played the decisive role in stopping the German advance. The 1st Infantry Division and supporting units were backed by layered artillery that included divisional artillery, corps artillery, and guns from adjacent sectors that could range into the threatened area. Fire Direction Centers coordinated 348 guns drawn from multiple divisions and corps. These guns were spread across dozens of kilometers, belonged to different commands, yet were brought under unified fire control within minutes. No other army in World War II could have assembled such firepower so quickly. German infantry and armor advancing toward Elsenborn Ridge encountered devastating artillery fire. Every attack was broken up. Units attempting to advance were struck by time-on-target missions that arrived without warning. Units attempting to regroup were shelled within minutes. German commanders reported that American artillery fire was so accurate and so responsive that offensive operations became impossible. The 6th Panzer Army, the main German striking force in the northern sector, was stopped largely by artillery alone. Tank losses were so severe that several panzer divisions reported losing more than half their armored vehicles. The official German post-war history of the battle concluded that the failure of the northern attack was due primarily to American artillery, not tanks and not air power. In the southern sector, around Bastogne, artillery again proved decisive.
The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in Bastogne, was supported by artillery battalions both inside the encirclement and firing from outside it. Forward observers with the paratroopers called for fire continuously. Fire direction centers coordinated responses from any guns that could range into the threatened areas. German forces attacking Bastogne encountered the same pattern seen elsewhere. Attempts to assemble for attacks were immediately met with massed artillery fire. Concentrations of troops or armor could not be maintained. German commanders reported that every movement during daylight drew American artillery fire within minutes. German counter-battery efforts were increasingly futile. By late 1944, American artillery had developed sophisticated counter-battery systems that integrated multiple intelligence sources. Sound-ranging units used microphones to triangulate the origin of enemy gunfire. Flash spotting posts plotted muzzle flashes at night from surveyed positions. Aerial observers in L-4 Cubs and fighter bombers reported any visible artillery activity. Prisoner interrogations provided additional information on unit locations and gun positions. All of this intelligence flowed into fire direction centers where detailed maps tracked known and suspected German artillery locations. When German guns fired, they were often detected within seconds. Coordinates were immediately passed to counter-battery fire direction centers with the highest priority. American doctrine called for immediate suppressive fire on any identified enemy artillery. German batteries that fired more than a few rounds could expect American counter-battery fire within 3 to 5 minutes. The result was a steady degradation of German artillery effectiveness. Batteries that revealed their positions were suppressed or destroyed. German gunners learned to fire brief missions and displace immediately. But displacement was slow, especially for horse-drawn units, which still made up the majority of German artillery. Many batteries were caught and destroyed during movement. Others survived only by firing a handful of rounds per day, and only in desperate circumstances. The ammunition situation made matters worse. By mid-1944, Allied air interdiction had devastated German logistics. Railroads and convoys were under constant attack. Ammunition production declined as factories were damaged and raw material supplies disrupted. According to Army historical studies, German 5th Panzer Army artillery in Normandy could fire only about 10% of the ammunition volume fired by British artillery in the same sector. The disparity was not caused by fewer guns, but by lack of ammunition. Mobility was another decisive factor. American artillery was fully motorized from the moment U.S. forces entered the war. Every gun was towed by a truck or mounted on a self-propelled chassis. The standard prime mover for the 105mm M2A1 howitzer was the 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, the famous Deuce-and-a-half. It could tow the gun at speeds up to 40 miles per hour on roads and traverse terrain impossible for horse-drawn units. Heavier guns required more powerful movers. The 155mm M1 howitzer was typically towed by the M5 high-speed tractor, a tracked vehicle capable of moving heavy guns across virtually any terrain. For the largest pieces, including the 155mm Long Tom and the 8-inch howitzer, the Army used the M4 high-speed tractor, an even more powerful tracked prime mover. American self-propelled artillery offered even greater mobility. The M7 Priest, mounting a 105mm howitzer on a tank chassis, was the standard self-propelled artillery of armored divisions. Each armored division fielded 3 battalions, 54 howitzers, capable of moving and fighting alongside tanks. The M7 could fire from position, displace rapidly under fire, and keep pace with armored advances. The M12 gun motor carriage, mounting a 155mm gun on a modified tank chassis, provided heavy direct fire capability. Though only a limited number were built, M12s proved devastating against fortified positions. During operations against the Siegfried Line, they were used as bunker busters, penetrating up to 7 feet of reinforced concrete. German artillery stood in stark contrast. Germany mobilized approximately 2.75 million horses during the war. Each infantry division required roughly 5,300 horses for artillery and logistics. A single artillery battery often needed 150 to 200 horses to move its guns, ammunition, and equipment. Horses required constant care, rest, and feed. Each animal consumed roughly 20 pounds of fodder per day, placing enormous strain on already overstretched logistics. By mid-1944, American artillery could move faster, fire more accurately, respond more quickly, and sustain higher volumes of fire than its German counterpart. It was not just superior firepower. It was a system, one the Germans never matched.
Horse-drawn artillery imposed severe limits on German mobility. Under favorable conditions, a horse-drawn battery could move no more than 25 kilometers per day. In rain, mud, or snow, movement often dropped to 10 kilometers per day or less. Hitching horses to guns, moving the battery, and unlimbering at a new firing position required 2 to 3 hours under ideal circumstances. Under combat conditions, enemy fire, darkness, or poor visibility, the process could take far longer. The contrast with American artillery was decisive. American motorized units could displace in 15 minutes and move 50 kilometers in an hour. German horse-drawn artillery required hours just to relocate and days to cover the same distance. This disparity fundamentally shaped battlefield outcomes. Dependence on horses created additional vulnerabilities. Horses were highly susceptible to artillery fire, air attack, exhaustion, and disease. A battery that lost significant numbers of horses could be immobilized for days until replacements arrived, if replacements were available at all. Horses also required constant care. Unlike trucks, which could be parked and ignored until needed, horses had to be fed, watered, groomed, and rested. German artillery units had to devote substantial manpower to animal care, reducing the number of soldiers available for combat tasks. Germany attempted to mechanize its artillery in 1943 and 1944, but the effort came too late and never reached sufficient scale. Some units received half-track prime movers or captured vehicles, but the majority of German artillery remained horse-drawn until the end of the war. Fully motorized or self-propelled artillery existed mainly in armored and elite mechanized divisions, which represented only a small fraction of the German army. The vast majority of German infantry divisions, and therefore the vast majority of German artillery, still relied on horses. In December 1944, American artillery received another force multiplier, the proximity fuse.
The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that measured the shell's distance from the ground as it fell. When the shell reached its optimal burst height, typically 15 to 20 meters above the surface, the fuse detonated automatically. Every round became an air burst without requiring complex time fuse calculations. The technology had been developed in extreme secrecy beginning in 1940. It was first used in air defense and later in the Pacific, where unexploded shells were unlikely to fall into enemy hands. American commanders initially prohibited ground use in Europe, fearing that German forces might recover intact fuses and reverse engineer them, potentially developing countermeasures that could devastate Allied bomber formations. The German Ardennes offensive changed everything. On December 16, 1944, as German forces smashed into American lines, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group authorized the use of proximity-fused shells near Monschau without approval. Axelson judged that the emergency outweighed the risks. He was right. The shells were devastating against attacking German infantry. On December 19th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses in ground combat. 2 days later, on December 21st, all restrictions were lifted. Proximity-fused ammunition flooded to the front. The effect was dramatic. Positions that offered solid protection against impact-fused shells, trenches, foxholes, slit trenches, provided little protection against overhead air bursts. Casualties increased by an estimated 3 to 4 times compared to contact-fused shells. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. German doctrine emphasized entrenchment and overhead cover as the primary defense against artillery. Soldiers who had survived months of combat by following these principles suddenly found them ineffective. Some reportedly refused to take cover at all, reasoning they were no safer in a foxhole than standing in the open. Unit cohesion suffered. Confidence in defensive procedures collapsed. The cumulative effect of American artillery superiority was crushing. Military historians estimate that roughly 70% of all ground combat casualties in World War II were caused by artillery and mortar fire. This figure applies across all armies, but the proportions were similar for German losses. Artillery was by far the most lethal weapon on the battlefield, more deadly than small arms, tanks, or air attacks. And American artillery was the most effective artillery system of the war. The German army recognized this even while the fighting continued. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy until his injury in July 1944, reported to Hitler that American artillery coordination far exceeded German capabilities. Rommel emphasized that Allied air superiority, combined with highly effective artillery, made German counterattacks extraordinarily costly and usually unsuccessful. After the war, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, commented on the impact of American mobility on the Eastern Front. He noted that Lend-Lease American trucks dramatically increased Soviet artillery mobility, allowing Soviet units to reposition faster than German horse-drawn artillery could respond. The observation was revealing. Even Soviet artillery, generally considered less sophisticated than American artillery in fire control, gained decisive advantage when paired with American mobility. The American artillery system was not the result of a single invention or sudden technological leap. It was the product of 2 decades of institutional development. Officers at Fort Sill studied World War I, identified systemic failures, developed solutions, tested procedures, and trained thousands of artillery officers in a new doctrine. Every element was designed to integrate with every other. The system required accurate maps with standardized grid coordinates, supplied in enormous quantities down to platoon level. It required reliable radio communications, maintained even in combat conditions. It required trained forward observers embedded with infantry at company level. It required meteorological sections to account for wind, temperature, and air density. It required survey teams to precisely locate gun positions. It required firing tables and graphical firing tables issued to every fire direction center. Every component mattered. Remove any single element and the system degraded. But with all elements functioning, the system delivered fast, precise, coordinated firepower that no other army could match. German soldiers facing that system learned to fear one sound above all others: the high-pitched engine of the Piper Cub overhead. Because they knew that sound meant death was 3 minutes away.
The Americans did not develop the most effective artillery system of the Second World War because they were smarter or braver than their opponents. They developed it because they identified a problem, committed resources to solving it, and built institutions capable of training soldiers and sustaining complex doctrine under combat conditions. German artillery officers understood fire control just as well as their American counterparts, but Germany's military development after World War I was constrained by the Treaty of Versailles. When rearmament began in the 1930s, German doctrine prioritized tanks and close air support to enable fast-moving offensive warfare. Artillery remained important, but it was not the central focus of doctrinal development. The Soviets pursued a different path. Their artillery doctrine emphasized mass and overwhelming volume rather than precision. On the vast battlefields of the Eastern Front, where targets were large and densely packed, this approach proved effective. British artillery evolved yet another way, emphasizing deliberate fire planning and systematic preparation. British gunners were highly skilled and widely respected by German opponents. Only the Americans, however, combined speed, precision, flexibility, and mass into a single, fully integrated system optimized for rapid response in fluid tactical situations. The Fire Direction Center allowed American artillery to function as if it were a single weapon with hundreds of barrels, all controlled by one coordinated command structure. Fires could be massed anywhere within range, within minutes of a target being identified. Much of this doctrine was shaped by officers whose names never became famous. Major General Carlos Brewer was one of the pioneers of American artillery doctrine. Though he commanded the 12th Armored Division during training, he was deemed too old to lead it in combat. Brewer requested a reduction in rank so he could serve overseas as an artillery officer. During 1944 and 1945, he worked on key artillery staffs in Europe, advising on fire control procedures and helping coordinate massive artillery concentrations that supported Allied offensives. After the war, he returned quietly to Kentucky, managed a small farm, and never sought recognition. He died in 1976 at the age of 85. Major General Orlando Ward played a central role in developing the Fire Direction Center concept. He commanded the 1st Armored Division in North Africa and later served as commandant of the Field Artillery School during World War II. After the war, he remained in the Army, eventually retiring as a lieutenant general.
Ward wrote extensively on combined arms operations and artillery employment. His papers are preserved at the Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. He died in 1972. Neither Brewer nor Ward became household names. No monuments were built in their honor. Their contributions appear mainly in professional military journals and official histories rather than popular accounts. Yet their work saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by enabling artillery to suppress enemy forces so effectively that infantry and armor could advance with fewer casualties. At the same time, their system killed tens of thousands of Axis soldiers who had no effective defense against precision-coordinated fire. The Fire Direction Center concept did not disappear with the war. It became standard NATO doctrine. The Soviets later developed their own centralized fire control systems, though these remained less flexible than the American model. Modern artillery doctrine still descends directly from the concepts developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s and refined during World War II. Computers have replaced graphical firing tables. GPS has replaced survey teams. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Centralized control, pre-computed data, rapid coordination of multiple batteries, and flexible allocation of firepower. The story of American artillery superiority in World War II is not a story of individual heroism, though artillerymen fought and died under extreme conditions. It is not a story of technological miracles, though innovations like the proximity fuse mattered greatly. It is a story of institutions, of doctrine written carefully in peacetime, of training programs that drilled procedures until they became automatic, of logistics systems that delivered millions of shells to thousands of guns operating continuously for months. It is a story of radios that kept working under fire, of maps printed and distributed down to platoon level, of meteorological data, survey teams, and firing tables prepared in advance so that when combat began, the system functioned without hesitation. Remove any one element, and the system degraded. With all elements working together, it delivered firepower no other army could match. The German army had capable artillery pieces and skilled crews. What it lacked was a fully integrated system. German artillery operated largely battery by battery, with limited ability to rapidly mass corps or army-level fires against fleeting targets. When German guns faced an enemy backed by a true integrated artillery system and by the largest industrial economy in the world, they were overwhelmed. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. That morning, American artillery fired its final combat missions, suppressing scattered German resistance in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Then the guns fell silent. Forward observers packed their radios. Fire direction centers shut down their plotting boards. But the system did not disappear. It survived in doctrine, training, and institutional memory. When American artillery went to war again in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and Iraq, the weapons changed and technology improved, but the core principles remained the same. Centralized fire direction, rapid response, flexible coordination, massed fires delivered with precision. That is how wars are won, not by single weapons or dramatic acts of heroism, but by systems built deliberately and executed professionally, by officers in classrooms writing doctrine, by technicians maintaining equipment, by logisticians moving supplies, by soldiers performing thousands of unglamorous tasks under pressure. American artillery in World War II worked because the system had been carefully designed, thoroughly tested, properly resourced, and relentlessly trained. German soldiers facing it learned there was no defense. They could dig deeper, move faster, and hide better, But when the Piper Cub appeared overhead, artillery fire would arrive with mathematical precision. That certainty, that inescapability, broke the Wehrmacht's ability to fight effectively in Western Europe. Not tanks, not air power alone. Artillery, the weapon the Americans perfected through years of systematic development. A weapon that demonstrated more clearly than any other that modern war is won by institutions and systems, not by individual brilliance alone.